his passion for leading others to reach their full potential. And along with pursuing a management PhD from George Washington University, he made it a goal to climb the highest points in every state. I think there's only 10 left right now. And these passions combined with the certificate he received from Georgetown University for executive leadership coaching and the mountaineering instruction certification he received from the National Outdoor Leadership School after a 30-day expedition in Alaska is what's created the drive behind his current passion, which specializes in bringing CEOs and leaders within companies to higher levels using natural outdoor challenges and expeditions. And I've heard him talk before on ethics and leadership before, so I'm excited, and I know we're in for a treat today. He also has a super cute little daughter. She's already gone on more expeditions in just 1 year of her life than I've gone on 30 years in mine. So go ahead, Nick.
All right. How's everybody doing? Thank you so much for the invitation and for such a kind introduction, Casey. I'm really honored to be here. I know I'm in the right place when we start with the Pledge of Allegiance. It's refreshing to see that. And I love speaking to Rotary Clubs because your ethos is service and giving back to communities. So I really appreciate that. And I'd like to just get started with a quick story for you all. In 2016, I just moved to Washington, D.C., which for an introverted mountaineer who hates heat and crowds was a really wonderful place. And so when my buddy Steve called me up, I was stationed with him in Washington State, and he said, "Hey, do you want to go ski in January for like a week before I deploy?" I was like, "Oh, heck yes, I am there." So we scheduled this trip, and I flew out there, and it looked like this. The avalanche reports looked all red, and you don't really need to be an expert in avalanche safety to see it's probably not a good idea. All the passes were closed, and we were like, this is our one chance. How are we going to do this? So we decided to drive 7 hours south down to Bend, Oregon, and try to find some good powder down there where we could safely ski. And I felt a little bit nervous about it, but I also felt okay because my wife and I had skied and climbed most of the volcanoes in the Pacific Northwest at that point, so we were pretty familiar with the terrain. I'd also just finished getting certified as a backcountry ski instructor for the National Academy. So I felt pretty comfortable in the terrain. And we got there, and it wasn't good, you all. While we were unloading Steve's truck, 6 inches of powder fell, which sounds amazing, but also you have all this extra powder sitting on top of the snow, and it's just a real danger for avalanches. But I looked at Steve, and I didn't want to be the guy who said, "Hey, I don't think we should do this." And I think he probably was thinking the same thing. And so we just threw our skis on and started up the hill. Unfortunately, about halfway up, we caught up with this group, and we said, "Oh, thank goodness, there are some locals. They probably know what's going on." Not really thinking that they were probably looking behind them, thinking, "Oh, thank goodness, some locals behind us. They know what's going on." We get to the top, and we pop out of the tree line. And it's just driving wind and snow, and it's freezing cold. And I think somewhere in the deep part of my mind, I was thinking, we should probably talk about whether this is a good idea. We can't even see. But it was just so cold and windy, and we couldn't hear. So we kind of looked at each other, gave each other the shrug, and popped in. And Steve jumped into the bowl and quickly started getting out of my range of vision in the whiteout conditions. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I don't keep up with Steve and he gets in an avalanche, I'm not going to know where the heck he is to dig him out. So I jump in, and then I realized really shortly after that, oh my gosh, if Steve gets caught in an avalanche, I'm going to be in the same avalanche. So we get to the bottom, and it was a great ride. And Casey did a really good job already kind of telling you all this, but this has been my journey kind of from flying helicopters and leading in the Navy to now in the reserves, getting some education around leadership and getting an opportunity to teach at the Naval Academy, and then turning that into an opportunity to take people and leaders outdoors, creating this community where we use shared adversity and adventures, and we use gritty experiential learning. And we dig into the philosophical and empirical inquiry into leadership. And it's this awesome company that our partners and I have created in Cairn Leadership. And yet, knowing all this, with all this experience and all these credentials, here I am at the bottom, And full disclosure, we did what any normal human being would do. We skied back up to the top and did it again because obviously nothing bad happened the first time. So some key points today. I think that making decisions is a fundamental part of leadership. It's what leaders do. In the Navy, commanding officers have complete authority and they also have complete responsibility. And that decision making is what weighs heavy on leaders' shoulders. And what I want to impart for you all today is that often there are physiological and psychological and emotional impacts on our decision making that we are not aware of, which is dangerous. And I think as leaders, we have a real responsibility to know about these things and everything we can to counter these things so that we're making clear-headed decisions and not just being led around. So back to the bottom of Mount Tumalo with Steve there. There are a lot of avalanche deaths, and it turns out that most of the deaths in avalanches are not beginners or people that didn't know what they're doing. They're actually experts. And Ian McCammon did some research because one of his friends who was an expert died in an avalanche, and he found some different heuristics that lead to that. Now, heuristics is simply a mental shortcut. We use them all the time. We need them. If I had to decide whether to brush my teeth or put on my deodorant first in the morning, it would be a really slow day. And I have that heuristic. It's already automated, which is great. But what Ian McCammon found is that we often rely on heuristics when it's not appropriate, when we think things are familiar, but they're actually not. So when I think that I know the Pacific Northwest, but it's actually a different condition, when I want social acceptance, I often don't use logic. I just look at the other person and hope that we're on the same page. When we're really committed to getting down that ski hill, because we flew out to the Pacific Northwest and drove 7 hours south, and this is our only chance to ski before he deploys and I go back to beautiful DC, we make bad decisions. So I'll share one more quick story. In my avalanche safety course, the instructor told me this, and he knew I was going to go into guiding. He said, you know, Knight, every time you go out and you take people outdoors, you're going to have two jars, and one is going to be full of marbles and it's labeled luck, and the other one is going to be empty and it's labeled experience. And each time you go out, you're going to learn some things, you're going to get some experience, you're going to take one of those luck marbles and you're going to put it into the experience jar. And over the years, you're going to start filling up that experience jar and you're going to feel better and better until one day you're at the bottom of some avalanche slope and you reach into the luck jar and you're going to find out that you're shit out of luck. So you're going to have to find me too. I apologize for that, but the story's better with the profanity. And the point there is, the most dangerous Navy pilots out there are the ones with 1,000 hours. The people who have experience and think that they know what's going on will make the worst decisions and be complacent about it. So here's what we think we are. We think we're on an aircraft carrier out in the South China Sea, operating finely tuned machine, completely logical. Here's what we actually are. Jonathan Haidt has some great research, and he has this allegory of human beings and our decision making as riders and elephants. And the elephant is our subconscious, our emotional brain. And that's how we make most decisions. We just feel good about it. Think about the last couple of things you purchased. Probably you saw the thing, maybe it's an iPad or an iPhone. You're like, this is a beautiful phone. And then you ask some questions like, well, what's the price and what's the speed and what's the storage? You don't think about those logical things first. You make an emotional decision and you backfill that emotional decision. It turns out that humans are crazy. Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky do some great research. I highly recommend Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a little bit weighty, but they talk through behavioral economics. They actually founded the field, and they find that we don't really think rationally. And I'll offer, and this is kind of scary, but Danny Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner for this work, says we actually can't fix that. There's nothing we can do about the way that we think, which is a little bit scary. Most of us here today would take $1,000 with 100% certainty that we'd get it over a 90% chance of getting $2,000, which statistically doesn't make sense because you have a better chance of getting more money with the second option. Most of us fear terrorism over health issues because terrorism's on the news more. So we don't think really clearly. Another great book here is You're Not So Smart. It's kind of cheeky and fun. But David McRaney runs through all kinds of different heuristics. I highly recommend it. But here's the thing, it gets more complicated. We're going to talk about ethics. Quick story, I was getting ready to deploying that Monday, and we're doing a quick functional check flight. And one of the last checks is making sure that the rotors spin at the right speed when we auto rotate. So I put the collective full down, start my auto rotation, and everything's looking good. The check passes, and then right at the last second, the NR, which is the instrument that tells you how fast the rotor head is spinning, just goes boop, right over the limit and then back down. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting in the seat thinking, wow, did anyone else see that? Does this mean that we have to take the aircraft back and fix it all weekend? If I say something, are all my sailors, including myself, going to be working all weekend on the last weekend before we leave for 7 months? And I had this burning, deep desire to just like not say anything and hope that nobody else said anything. And I firmly believe that lying is the wrong thing to do. And yet I really wanted to, and I wanted to justify it. Well, it's the right thing to do because then my sailors won't have to work all weekend. And I want to offer that this is a test of integrity. And there are often situations in life where we know the right thing to do, but it's a hard thing to do. And so we try to make logical arguments not to do it, or to do the other easy wrong thing to make it seem a little bit more appealing. And we have to be really careful about that. The other side of this equation is an ethical dilemma. So imagine you're a mountain guide, you're on Everest, you have a group of 10 people who have paid you a lot of money to get them safely up the mountain, and up toward the top, you see someone who's barely moving, barely breathing, on the brink of death. What would you do? Well, a lot of people probably, hopefully, are thinking, well, I think the ethical thing to do is probably to save the person. Summiting the mountain isn't the most important thing. But when you start putting in other responsibilities, Joseph Batacaro has a great article about this, and he talks about ethical dilemmas as conflict between different priorities. So if you're a family person, maybe I'm a father, I own a business, I'm a member in a community, I'm a member in a society, and sometimes doing the right thing for my business is the wrong thing for society. Sometimes doing the right thing for my family is the wrong thing for my business. And these different responsibilities pit themselves against each other. So if I'm the mountain guide, and if I don't get these people to the top, my business goes out of business, and then I have a bunch of people who can't support their families, that's going to weigh heavily on my mind. If I'm a mountain guide and taking this person back down the mountain when there's a storm bearing down on us could slow us down and has a high potential of killing all of my clients, including myself, for a person who's almost certainly going to die anyway, all of a sudden it becomes more of an ethical dilemma and less of a test of integrity. When there are two wrongs, when there are two rights that don't seem quite right, and there aren't really any other options, that's when we have this ethical dilemma. And it's important as leaders to figure out which one you're in. So interestingly, I Googled as I prepare for this presentation, what are ethical dilemmas in business? And some that come up are discrimination, unsafe work practices, corporate espionage, dishonest accounting, firing whistleblowers. And I think that's interesting because not a single one seems like an ethical dilemma. I think everyone here would agree that those things are all tests of integrity. We know not to discriminate. Maybe it's hard not to sometimes. Maybe it seems appealing to hire one person over another person, but we know it's wrong. Ethical dilemmas, in my mind, are things like the military using artificial intelligence and robots to possibly kill people, when we know that it's going to reduce deaths in combat and maybe make wars end faster, but there's a high potential for a robot to kill an innocent person. How do we grapple with that? Ethical dilemmas are things like Facebook trying to figure out what goes on your feed and telling people, influencing people heavily, and trying to weigh freedom of speech at the same time. An ethical dilemma would be researching cures for cancer and realizing that maybe some people are going to die because of the research, but a high potential of a cure for everyone else. How do you make those decisions? So just a really fast primer on ethical reasoning, because I think it's fascinating. Maybe some of you have heard of the trolley problem. There's a trolley bearing down a track and there are 5 people tied to it. When we start talking about ethical reasoning, things just don't make sense. So we have to push the I believe button. There are 5 people tied to this track for whatever reason, and we see the trolley coming, and we're on top of a bridge with a really big person. And we know if we push the really big person over the bridge onto the track, that they're going to be big enough to stop the trolley. But that person will probably perish in that heroic act of yours, I guess, for pushing them. What do? Well, a couple philosophers for you. Immanuel Kant would say, hey, Do you want a world where everybody's going to push everybody off bridges to stop trolleys? Probably not. And he would say that's a categorical imperative. If you don't want that to happen every time in every situation, then it's not right. And that's great, but there isn't any wiggle room. And sometimes, like, there could be extenuating circumstances that make this seem much more appealing in ethical decision making. So John Stuart Mill came up with utilitarianism, and he said, hey, the thing that we really want is happiness. So whatever creates the most happiness is what we're going to do. And if saving 5 people for one person's life means there's 5 times more happiness, we should do that. But that sure seems cold and calculating. It's weird math to me, and I'm not even that good at math. But who are these people? And maybe that one person we pushed over is going to cure cancer for the whole world. And what are all the variables? And when we put all those variables in there, it doesn't seem like that's the best way to make a decision. So we go to Aristotle and virtue ethics, and Aristotle says that life is just this journey, and every decision you make, every action you make turns into habits, turn into your character, and you're always on this continuum where you're learning to be courageous and temperate and wise as a human being and seeking this full potential as a human being. But that sure doesn't give me any answers. I like the math when I think about that. So what I would offer is back to Joseph Battacaro. You have all these different things, and I think as I was younger, I thought, well, I have to be utilitarian, or I have to be a duty ethics person. Like, I have to have my code, and it has to be one of these philosophers. But that's not the case. You can take these and apply them in different situations. But things get a little bit more perplexing. So if I ask you all, if there are 2 siblings, a brother and a sister, who truly, deeply love each other, and there's no way, absolutely no way they can procreate, would it be okay for them to have sex? Well, this is a question that Jonathan Haidt again asked, and unsurprisingly, most people said no. But when he asked why, they gave up to 6 reasons, and all of the reasons were clearly refuted in the whole problem. People would say, well, if they had children, then they might have birth defects. Well, they can't have children, right? That's the example. And after giving 6 reasons, people would still say, well, it's just not right. I don't like it. It's wrong. And what he found was something called moral dumbfounding. We know kind of what our decision is before we even make it. And when we're asked to logically back up our decision, we can't really do it. So here's the point. Emotions drive our decisions. Hopefully, likely, when I said that, a lot of you had like this little bubble of disgust, right? Brother, sister sex, that's disgusting. And that bubble of disgust is what made you say, well, no, that probably isn't right. But think other emotions like anger might make us less likely to care about other people and what they think. Guilt might make us try to get away from them. And ironically, joy, as you see here, back to the snow and powder, makes us more likely to push the person over the bridge. Gets even thicker, this plot, because our endocrinology, the different hormones in our blood, can really impact our decision making. Testosterone makes us want to win, and when we win, we get more of it. But it also is linked to bad actions, unethical actions. It's linked to doing the winner takes all type actions. Things like Enron are driven by testosterone. Other hormones like cortisol, people want to get away from them. So maybe lying gets you away from the stress hormone of cortisol, or maybe not saying anything or getting away from that situation will help you out. Some hormones like oxytocin, it's called the moral molecule by Paul Zak, is really useful and helpful in moral and ethical reasoning. And at the same time, we might decide to lie for family members or do the wrong thing to protect people we love. Ooh, so what do we do about this? First, I would offer an article that I read in 2010 on one of my deployments called Leadership in Solitude by William Derowitz. It's really hard to say his last name. I apologize. But what he said is profound in some ways. He said that, we have all this social media, we have these articles, we have all these books, and none of the thoughts in those sources are our own. We're not thinking about these really important things and creating our own moral foundation. We're just maybe reading things and maybe not even. It's astounding to me how many leaders we work with at Cairn Leadership who have no clue what their core values are. And I wonder, if you don't know what your core values are, how you're going to be able to make ethical reasoning and decisions. So I encourage every leader to be reading. I think of General Mattis and his library of hundreds and thousands of books and how much he reads. And that is a requirement, I think, for a leader to really think about philosophy and how you're going to make these decisions before you have to confront them. I'm an AV guy, so checklists are awesome. And it turns out that avalanche safety also has checklists. And I think the point here is that when you think you might have to make ethical decisions, which is always as a leader, if you don't think through things logically, when you don't have to, when you're not fatigued, when you don't have testosterone coursing through your body, when you don't have a high emotional state, you won't do it. You're going to be on that elephant, and the elephant's going to be rampaging, and you're just along for the ride, and there's nothing you can do. But if you think through how are we going to make these decisions prior to that, then you have a chance. So it comes down to how are you using these plans and these checklists and these checkpoints to help you make better decisions. And I would say in culture, you need to make it really transparent. You need to talk about these human factors, the fact that your emotion can profoundly affect the decisions that you make, the fact that hormones affect the decision that you make, the fact that there are all these biases. Your people should be reading You're Not So Smart so that they can see them and point them out. Because if one person says, hey, this doesn't seem safe, this is familiar terrain, but it's not the same day, you could save the whole group from getting in an avalanche. And if no one speaks up because of these factors, then everybody gets caught in the avalanche and it's a really bad day. I love in avalanche terrain, we call green, yellow, and red light terrain. And what we do is make a decision before we go out skiing. If it's this steep, we're not going to touch it. That's red light. If it's this steep, we'll think about it, but we're going to do some tests before we do it. And if it's this steep, green light, we're going to go have fun. And by doing that logical work up front, you enable your team to say, hey, we said we're not going to ski this terrain. Hey, we said we're not going to make decisions when we're in a high emotional state. Maybe we should just make this decision tomorrow. Having that terrain personally as a leader, saying like, this is when I make important decisions. I always am going to sleep on it, or whatever works for you is really important. I just interviewed Dee Dee Halfhill. She's a colonel in the Air Force. She does some amazing work in coaching as well. And she said, for her, whenever she feels resistance, when she feels a little bit of fear, she takes a pause. And if you can build in a checkpoint like that, a decision point, where if I feel resistance to an idea, I'm going to take a pause. If I feel really excited about skiing down a slope, I'm going to take a pause. That can save you in the long run. A culture of feedback.
This is Kim. Sorry, I'm just going to jump in and give you your 2-minute warning. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. I think I can do it. A culture of feedback is also really important. And I would offer that just knowing that you're going to have a debrief at the end of whatever it is, at the end of a decision, at the end of a quarter as a business, will deeply impact your decisions. Knowing that your people are going to have an opportunity to ask you why you made a decision will force you to think through, well, this is why, and here's my logical reasoning, instead of just having an emotional reaction and then backing it up with logic. Lastly, I want to share one of my favorite quotes from General Patton. He said, "Fatigue makes cowards of us all." And I think all of this goes out the window when we get tired, when we have all of these things going on. We have COVID, we have unrest in the United States, we have all these things that we're grappling with as leaders. It fatigues us. We have decision fatigue. We have physical fatigue. We're up not taking care of ourselves. And when that happens, you don't realize what's going on. You just kind of go into your shell. And so having a plan for that, having a second or another person to rely on who you can trust to say, hey, you're really tired, you're not making great decisions, can be really important. Key points here: decision making is a fundamental function of a leader. Absolutely. There are unseen things that are going on behind the scenes in our brains, in our bodies, that are impacting our decisions. And it's our responsibility to know what those are and look out for them and have processes and checklists in place to counter those things. All right. I appreciate your time. That's a lot to pack into 25 minutes. I'd love to talk to people more. My contact information's on here if you're interested. We take people outdoors and help them become better leaders through adventures and a lot of great science. Appreciate it. Open for questions.
Great. Thank you so much for your talk. I have to first apologize.